So let's start with governance and the agency model and the relationships. So you would normally have shareholders, and the shareholders would appoint and or dismiss a board of directors. And the board of directors act as stewards, act on behalf of the shareholders. The board would then appoint and oversee a C-suite executive who would report back to the board on a regular basis at every single board meeting, plus the interim meetings and discussions. The shareholders provide capital to the executive, and the executives act as agents, generating a return on investment for that capital. So that's your traditional agency model of how a basic corporate governance structure would look. Okay, so the shareholders will start by electing and appointing a board of directors. And that board of directors will report regularly to the shareholders. Typically, you would also have the shareholders elect and appoint an external auditor. So if you're a publicly listed entity, this would happen at an AGM. And that external auditor will not only report to the shareholders, but will obviously report to the board of directors on a regular basis as well. The board will elect numerous committees to help it in its work, and I'll go into board committees later. So a board's got several checks and balances. Your head of risk management, your head of compliance, your head of internal audit should all be reporting independently to the board of directors so that the board's got independent checks and balances other than the reports it's getting from the executive as well. It is extremely good practice to ensure that the chairman of your audit committee is an independent board member from the organisation. Now, the board's first role, other than setting strategy, is to actually appoint the chief executive, and the chief executive will report to the board. In the old days, the board would only appoint the chief executive. These days, it's very good practice and extremely common for the board not only to appoint the CEO, but the board is also involved in the C-suite level that reports to the CEO. Main reason being that you don't want your CEO to surround himself with a whole bunch of yes men. And you want to be able to give access to the C-suite independently to some of the board members. So you would want your CFO building a relationship with the chairman of the audit committee. You would want your chief risk officer building a relationship with the risk committee. You would want your head of compliance, if he was reporting into the audit committee, to do the same thing as well. So the board has access not just to the CEO, the board has access to multiple points inside the organization. I'm not a lawyer, but changing law takes a long time. Changing corporate governance codes and making them mandatory is a lot easier to do. So you will see across the Middle Eastern region that yes, we do have company law, but it takes a long time to evolve company law. So you'll find governments introducing codes of corporate governance which are either mandatory or recommended, depending on the jurisdiction and the types of business you're in. You wouldn't have the board approving procedures. You will have the board approving policy. And then from the policy, you're developing the procedures underneath. So for example, your code of ethics. Your code of ethics needs to align with the corporate governance requirements of the country. You, the board, need to approve it, and then the executive needs to ensure that the whole of the organization adheres to it. You'll have some sort of a board charter, which is set up right from the beginning. What's the role? What's the responsibility? What's the scope of the board? So that board members actually understand what they're doing. You'd also have charters for committees. The code of ethics I mentioned earlier on, and all of that paints a sort of very generic, simple model of corporate governance. I'm not talking about subsidiary corporate governance or joint ventures. We'll build on the knowledge as we move along. Now, Bob Tricker first mentioned the term corporate governance back in 1984, and he's seen by many corporate governance subject matter experts as the founder of corporate governance. And he came up with a very understandable definition of corporate governance. He said, if management is about running the business, governance is about seeing that it's run properly. There's another expression I've heard Chris Pierce, who built the Institute of Directors in London, and Chris was the chap that originally trained me over 20 years ago. He came up with the expression that The board should have its nose in the business, but its fingers out. So the board needs to know everything that's going on and has the legal right to know absolutely everything that's going on. But your fingers are out because that's the role of the executive. So you need to be very, very clear in terms of the governance oversight that the board brings, but the application and implementation that the executive team brings to it. Banks are different because their collapse doesn't just only affect their shareholders. So it affects a much wider circle of other businesses, depositors, other banks as well. So a collapse of a bank can actually create a domino effect and impact an economy as well, which is why historically we've seen a lot of the codes of corporate governance and risk management were driven primarily from banks and from regulators because of the risks of potentially a bank actually failing. Now, it could actually undermine the financial system in itself as well. So Lehman Brothers, who had a theatre production lady on their board, who had a naval commander on their board, who had the CEO, the chairman, and the chair of the risk committee as the same person, and the risk committee only ever met once per year. When you actually start looking at the board composition of Lehman, it was a disaster waiting to happen. And that had the domino effect. That was the initial start of what happened in 2008. In the old days in the Middle East, and maybe even in Western Europe, when you were appointed to a board, it was prestigious. It was, we're going to have 4 nice long lunches per year, and I'm the board member of a bank. That's no longer the case now. That you're dedicating 20 to 30 days per year of your time. You are personally liable. You've got to understand the rules, the laws, the regulations, the checks, the balances, and then you've got to act as a strategic sparring partner to the executive. You need to guide them. You need to be able to sit back and help them with their strategy and others. And we'll talk about strategy a bit later on. This region has the highest number of joint ventures in the world. So when you have, let's say, a firm in Saudi and a firm in Europe setting up a joint venture, the firm in Europe is bringing in the technical know-how. The firm in Saudi is bringing in access to the Saudi market. Unless you're very, very clear from the beginning what both partners want from that joint venture, and you have a very clear joint venture agreement, it makes it very difficult for the board of the joint venture that needs to report to both parties later to try and get the right balance in place. I'm aware of a regulator going through a boardroom rotation, and I was recently told they wanted somebody young. And I went, what do you mean they want somebody young? Regulators always want somebody, you know, the fuddy-duddy old regulator. And I was told, no, they're looking for somebody that's got a lot more fintech, Bitcoin experience, which by definition means they're going to be under the age of 30. And that's going to be interesting to see the dynamics where you're trying to bring on the youth onto boards that have got the subject matter expertise, but might not necessarily have the EQ to be a board member. One thing is us contradicting each other. It's a real skill for me to disagree with you without being disagreeable. And that comes with age and wisdom. And a lot of the times when I'm in a board meeting and I'm looking at people, it's not so much what they say, it's what they haven't said. And one of the difficulties I've always had with holding board meetings on Zoom is I want to see your body language when the CEO is presenting that. Because I'm not looking at him when he's presenting, I'm looking at you, you, and you, because I can already feel what your reactions. I can't do that on Zoom. On Zoom, I'm just listening to him, and I'm not getting the inputs or the other variables. So Zoom is okay when it's a standard board meeting, there's nothing of issue or large substance to cover. I like your idea, and I've seen it in 1 or 2 other family businesses in Saudi, where you've got the board comprised of the family elders, and I've physically seen this numerous times. So you've got the board table in the middle of the room, You've got the board members sitting around it with the chairman of the board at the top, and I always insist the board secretary sits beside the chairman. And then you've got the kids that sit around the outside of the room. They are obliged to attend board meetings for at least 5 or 6 years. They're not allowed to say squeak. Nothing. They're there to listen and observe. And that's the way some of the families in the region, the more developed families, are starting to try and bring up their youth, because if they don't bring them into the boardroom beforehand, they're not going to learn. If they're bringing them into the boardroom and they let them free, and it's a 25-year-old that's just finished his MBA, he's going to be coming out with both guns and something's going to be upset. So having them sit in there and listen, but not speak for several years, then all of a sudden they start to pick up on the history, the way things are said, the way father didn't raise that issue. And they came back next board meeting and it was solved. So we're seeing board members' roles move from their fiduciary duty, which is protecting shareholders and making sure you comply with the rules and laws, to actually wanting to generate value. And one of the main value drivers of a board these days is actively contributing to the strategy of an organization. So you should be spending less and less of your time on the compliance and the operational reports, and more time helping the executive develop their strategies moving forward. Board roles are becoming, therefore, a lot more complex and a lot more time intensive. So you will need probably around, and this is a survey from the IOD, just before COVID, you've got about 30 hours per year serving as a committee member. So if you're a board member, you're also going to be appointed to 1 or 2 of the committees. So you might be a board member and you might be chairing the audit committee, especially if you've got a background as one of the big 4. So you'll have several committee meetings as well as several board meetings. You'll need to spend a substantial amount of time reading all the board papers, reading the executive summaries, thinking it through, talking with fellow board members before you get into the board meeting. And we're starting to see regulators in the GCC limiting the number of board positions you can actually have on publicly listed companies, because they factually know that you cannot give the time you need to give if you're sitting on so many boards. And by the way, at some point, you're going to be conflicted as well. It was interesting. McKinsey did a survey last year, global survey, and I've got these slides in the strategy session. 50% of global board members do not understand the corporate strategy. And then another 30% out of the ones that do understand it don't understand the details. So it's scary. Lots of board members do not understand the strategy, and they're not spending the time. What are the reasons I would want my CEO to sit on the board? If I get my CEO to sit on the board, he carries the same personal liabilities as I do, because he's a board member and he's involved in the operations. What's the disadvantage of having the CEO sit on the board?
Conflict of interest. Too much influence.
If you are a board member, you are entitled legally by law to attend every single board meeting. Actually, it's illegal to hold a board meeting without having invited all the board members. So what happens if I want to talk about the CEO with the rest of the board and he's a board member? So the way I get around that is the contractual agreement with the CEO is, yes, you are a board member, but the board is allowed to hold executive sessions of the board without you present if we so choose.